friends, for our family, and this is just again about gaining more confidence in your skills as a photographer. At this stage, we have mastered our fully manual mode. At least I hope you've been out there practicing it as well. But it is now time to start looking at issues that you may be encountering. And white balance is a very important one to understand. Like for example, in these shots here, white balance really affects the overall quality feel to your work. If you are faced with a situation like this where you've got a big responsibility to get the shot right, you need to have your technical skills refined. And as I mentioned, you firstly need to look at a photograph. If you've got an issue like this, you need to be able to identify the problem, troubleshoot it, and correct it. Otherwise, you're going to struggle. You're going to miss the shot. You're going to begin to panic. And you can imagine, with a shot like this at a wedding, if the colours aren't right, especially the dress, if the dress is not white, the bride is going to be a little bit unhappy. And white balance can also change the mood and the atmosphere in an image. They can make images feel very cold, like in the previous photograph, or something like this, like the poor baby here. What do we think looking at this shot of the baby here? What kind of message is being sent with this colour here? How does the baby look? Does the baby look healthy? Exactly, Sean, Louise. Yeah, Lanil, you're totally spot on. The baby looks ill. The baby doesn't look healthy. The baby does not look, the baby looks sick. This is not something that we'll want to see in our own photographs of our children or for photographing for a client. They're not going to want to get a photograph where their babies or their children look green. Poor white balance is extremely unflattering, and it's very important to be aware of how this affects your images and aim to prevent it at all costs. Otherwise, your shots will lack in mood and atmosphere, and they just won't look visually appealing at all. So, let's just get right into this and start breaking down our white balance. Now, there are so many different types of light that we encounter on a daily basis, and there are loads of different light sources that we experience. We have light from the sun, we have fluorescent light tubes, light bulbs that might be in your office at work. You might have LED lights at home as well. You might also have tungsten lights that you might find in your ceiling or your bedside lamp. You might have the flash on your own camera as well. All these different light types have what's called a color temperature, which means that the color of the light they produce is very different. So in all the various lighting conditions we would be familiar with, each of these lighting conditions will produce light that's a very different color. So Jonathan, you're asking, what is tungsten? Well, if you think tungsten is more like the kind of lights you find in your bedside lamp, or the lights that you'd have, just at home, just that type of kind of warm type of light that you have in your bedside lamps or in your lamps in your living room and so on. Now, for the most part, our eyes and our brain work together to help us deal with various light sources, and we constantly make adjustments in our brains so that we see things normally instead of the colour that these lights produce. And we'll discuss that in detail in just a few more moments. But cameras don't really adapt themselves as well to these different types of light as our eyes. As we've seen before when it comes to exposure and so on, our cameras are far more limited than our eyes, and this comes to be the case when we talk about colour as well. So, the term colour temperature comes from physics. The different temperature or the heat of a light source is the difference in the colour it emits. So the different colours that light can produce are measured on a scale called the Kelvin scale as seen on screen. So this is the Kelvin scale, and I saw a couple of people mention that already. Now, it's a little bit of a contradiction in terms of how we discuss it. So it could be a little bit confusing at first, but it's just pay attention and it'll make a little bit more sense. But in terms of how we discuss it, the hotter a light source, the colder the light it produces. Okay, so we just discussed it in terms of how we see this. So we would say as photographers that the image, if it has a strong red tone, say from candlelight, we would say that this is a very warm image. But actually, the light it produces is a cooler light. Okay, so that might sound like a little bit of a contradiction, but at least you're totally spot on. It's a little bit backwards, like f-stops, okay? But yes, this is the way it works. We look at a photograph that would have kind of an orange or a red tone to it. We would call this a warm image. However, the light it produces is actually a cooler light source. So let's think about this. If you're familiar with science in high school, or if you did science back in school, or perhaps you're familiar with, you do a little bit of welding or anything like that. But if you think about Bunsen burners, or you think about a welder's flame, what happened when we went very, very hot with our Bunsen burners, or if we got very hot with our welder's flame? What colour does the flame go? Colin, you're spot on there straight away. Tanya, you're spot on there too. Elise, Nadim, yeah, you're absolutely spot on. It goes blue. So the really, really high temperature flame goes blue. This is the same concept when it comes to color temperature. The actual lower temperature was a warmer looking color. It was a bright orange, but that was actually a much lower temperature than that bright blue that we got when we increased the flame. Okay, does that make sense? So that's the physics behind it. The actual higher the temperature, the colder the flame looked. Okay, so but in terms of our photography, photographers tend to say things the way that they see them. So we would still say an image that has a lot of orange tones in it is actually a warm photograph. So we tend to say things that we, just the way that we see it, we describe it just because it's a little bit easier for us. So when we look at a cold photograph, we would call it a cold photograph. If we look at a warm photograph, we call it a warm photograph. But in actual fact, the physics behind it is the opposite. Now, so different light sources and even different times of day can create different color casts in your image. This can be seen as a positive or a negative thing. Okay, now probably more likely it's going to be a negative effect that we have on our photographs, but as we will see later on, you can take control of color temperature and you can use it creatively as well. So before we look at different color temperatures, I do need to talk about the term daylight. Daylight is a term you're going to hear quite often in relation to photography, and it's not just to do with a time of day, but daylight refers to a color temperature, a color that has no color cast. Okay, so daylight is essentially when there's no color in your light that's creating a color cast. In other words, it's a neutral light source. Now, this will make a little bit more sense in just a moment. But daylight is white light, and therefore when it falls on the subject, all the scenes, or all the colours in the scene should look correct because they are not contaminated by the colours in the light source. So we'll be looking at some examples of this a little bit later on, so don't worry if this concept is new to you now. Now, just before we go on, I just want to confirm, can everybody see my slideshow there on their screens? Excellent, everybody can see it there, fantastic, great. So I just wanted to make sure it's very, very important when we look at these next few examples that everybody can see what I am talking about. Now, so here is an example of an image that we would call a daylight balanced photograph, okay? Now, basically this is light that doesn't contain any contaminating colours. Now, there's a very obvious way to identify colour contamination in your photographs. Can anybody tell me how we know that this photograph is not colour contaminated? What? Yeah, there we go. Puneet is in there straight away. Even just straight away. And Nadeem, you're spot on there as well. There's a very obvious indicator here that lets me know that this image is correctly balanced, and that is everybody's getting it there. It's white. The whites are white. The most obvious way to identify color contamination in your photographs is to look at the whites in your images, if there is any whites in the photographs. If the whites are white, then all other colors will be free of contamination too. This will mean that all of the other colors in the shot are going to be represented naturally, as they're not going to contain any contaminating colors. Now, don't worry if you don't understand what I mean by the term contaminating colors. It'll make a lot more sense when we have a look at some of these other examples. Now, so For example, with fluorescent light, one of the most common conditions that we would find ourselves under is this type of lighting situation, fluorescent light. And it's usually the type of light that you'd find in an office space. I'm actually looking at some fluorescent light right now, in industrial buildings and so on. It covers a broad range of colours from about 4,000 to 7,000 kelvins, but the most common is the kind of greenish blue found up at around 7,000 K. So looking at this photograph here, what colour are we seeing in the white lab coat? Yeah, Katrin, you were saying there it's a little bit too blue. Yeah, absolutely. It's a grey kind of blue. So we're seeing slightly different colours. What in actual fact is a kind of what I'd call nearly an aqua type of colour. Kind of a blue-grey, but it's falling in there. If we have a look at the Kelvin scale, if we have a look at 7,000 kelvins, we can see that it's this kind of light blue, kind of effect. And we can see that it's very, very similar, in the lab coat. So it's very easy to identify in this photograph that the colour is not correct. Because we look at the white lab coat, we look at the white paper here as well, and there's clearly a bit of a colour cast to the shot. Okay, so looking at some other examples here as well. Candlelight is what we would call a cold light source in terms of physics, but as photographers we say this is a warm image because we say what we see, and it has a very low temperature in terms of the kelvins, and we see it's between about 1,500 kelvins and about 2,000 kelvins, and it produces a very strong red or orange tone across the image. Now this can be quite atmospheric depending on the shot. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes it can cause you issues. You may not want to have the entire shot having this wash of red or orange across the shot. So for example, if I look at the wall here in the photograph, I have no indication at all as to what the correct colour for this wall should be. Okay, because I've never seen this wall before, I don't actually know what colour the wall should be at all. To me, it looks like it's an orangey kind of red colour, when in actual fact it could be white. Okay, and Andrew, you're asking, is it white? Well, we don't really know. We can make an educated guess that this is white. We don't really know fully because there is a cast on the photograph. Now, the photo is not wrong. Okay, so I can see Mafalda asking, is this photo wrong? Well, this is where white balance becomes a creative decision. Okay, white balance can be seen as a positive thing as well as a negative thing. And you would argue that the actual colour cast here adds to the effect of the photograph. And this is something we see quite often, particularly with these kind of warmer looking photographs, like for example our morning and evening light. Morning sun or evening sun will produce a slightly higher temperature. You're going to be looking in at around 2,500 kelvins, and it will produce strong oranges in your image. So when you're out shooting in the early sun, it's the colour of the light that produces these strong colours that you see. So for example, if we have a look at the clouds here, we can see very much the cast in those clouds. We know clouds should be white, perhaps a little bit grey as well, but they very much have this kind of colour cast to them. But we wouldn't say that this is wrong. This is a creative decision that we can now make as photographers. Looking at this particular scene, we have this lovely, intense kind of orangey red in the shot. So white balance doesn't always have to be seen as a negative thing, and this is something you're going to be able to make a decision with. When you're out there, you're photographing your sunsets, you're probably kind of thinking, how can I get those oranges to be more intense? Well, now you're going to be able to adjust the white balance to add a little bit more colour to the shot. Now, certainly in a scene where it would be seen as a negative is in our tungsten light. So a lot of people ask, what is tungsten light? Well, tungsten light, as I said, is the type of light that you're going to find in your standard lamps. Okay, can anybody tell? Yeah, I was about to ask, can anybody tell me what's wrong with this shot? But Julie and Elsie are in there straight away in terms of Melody. You're right there as well, Kitty. Yeah, the skin is yellow. The lady here, she looks jaundiced, as a couple of people are saying there as well. This is a negative effect on the photograph. This doesn't look visually appealing at all. It's not flattering. Okay, so this is a type of situation that we do kind of as photographers. I suppose this is a particular type of lighting situation that we would struggle a little bit, especially because it's one that we find ourselves in quite frequently. So if you're at home, you're photographing in the